Following the time of the judges, we see the rise of kingship in Israel and the relatively brief period we call the United Monarchy. There are just 3 kings to discuss from this time period, and this short video will briefly talk about the origins of the monarchy along with each of these kings. The rise of kingship in Israel begins with Samuel. Like Isaac and Jacob before, Samuel's story begins with his miraculous birth to a barren mother. He was raised in the temple, and he grew up to become a great prophet and judge of the nation of Israel. Now, as he became older, Samuel appointed his sons to be judges after him. The problem was that his sons were corrupt, and the people instead asked Samuel to provide for them a king like all the other nations. And Samuel was grieved by this, but God tells him that the people are not actually rejecting him, Samuel, they're rejecting God. But it is at this point that we meet the man who would become the first king of Israel, a man by the name of Saul. Now, I refer to his story as a tragedy because he starts out with incredible promise, but ends up as an ultimately failed king. He's first chosen by God, and then his identity is later revealed to Samuel. And this will be confirmed by lot casting. And in this whole episode, Saul shows incredible humility. But immediately after this, we read another episode where God's Spirit comes upon Saul and he prophesies. Now remember that the time of the judges revealed an association of Israelite tribes that were not united and often, in fact, were at war with one another. That was how the book of Judges concluded. And Saul manages to successfully unite the tribes together. And this was a tremendous accomplishment. He then leads them into battle and has considerable military success. Things seem to be looking very good with Saul early on. But his early successes make his downfall all the more tragic. There are a number of issues we see with Saul, so I will just point out a few of them. First, we see that he assumes the role, takes the role of a priest, taking it upon himself to perform sacrifices when Samuel is late in meeting him. And for this transgression, Samuel tells Saul that God will not establish a dynasty through him, through Saul. Most significantly, we see how Saul disobeys the commands of holy war when he conquers the Amalekites. Now, we saw before in the last video with Achan, after the destruction of Jericho during the conquest, that a violation against the regulations of holy war was a very, very serious offense. And then at the end of Saul's reign, we even have an example of Saul consulting a medium or a witch at Endor, which is a form of divination that is strictly prohibited. When Saul performs the sacrifices as a priest, God says, rejecting Saul, he says that he's instead looking for a man after God's own heart. Like what happened with Saul, David is revealed privately to Samuel, who then anoints him to be king. We have more biographical information about David than any other person in the Old Testament. And it's far too much that we could cover in this short video. So instead, we're just going to touch on a few highlights. One of the earliest events we see is David's victory over Goliath, the Philistine giant and champion. And in that story, David succeeds against all odds. because God was the one fighting on behalf of the nation. And David recognizes that. Goliath taunts the armies of Israel, and David is the one who recognizes that it's actually he's the one who's being insulted by Goliath, and that God would be the one to handle the situation. And so David kills the Philistine giant, and after that, Saul brings this young shepherd boy into his service. But Saul very quickly grew jealous of David and sought to kill him. David eventually had to flee from Saul, spent the next several years as a fugitive in his own country. During this time, there were hundreds of people who had been suffering and mistreated under Saul's rule, and they began to gather themselves around David. However, David refused to fight against Saul. Even though Saul was pursuing him, instead, David would fight against Israel's enemies. Saul was eventually killed, and David was then anointed as the new king over Israel. But even this did not go smoothly. There was actually a rival king for 7 years, Ishbosheth or Ishbaal. Now, he eventually dies. But again, like he treated Saul, David was not going to lift a hand against him. David, he continues to have great military success, similar to the miraculous victories that Israel experienced during the conquest. He even conquered the city of Jerusalem, which he then established as his capital. Now, he announces his intentions to build a permanent temple. Remember, they're still using the tabernacle, which is sort of a portable temple. It's, the tent. And David wants to build a permanent temple. However, the prophet Nathan acts as sort of an advisor to the king. He delivers a message for David. And through, God speaking through Nathan, uses kind of a play on words. God says that David would not build a house for him, but instead that God would build David a house, and meaning that God was going to establish a dynasty through David. And this becomes known as the Davidic covenant, and it was central to Israelite theology. This was a very key concept for the nation of Israel. In this covenant, God says that his descendant, David's descendant, would build the temple, not David himself. But more than this, God also promises that David's kingdom would be an everlasting kingdom. The promise of God's covenant with David is partially fulfilled in his son, Solomon, but it also contains the beginning of a hope that eventually there will come a descendant of David who would fully fulfill God's promise. Now, this promise, along with God's promise to Abraham, is one of the two central hopes for the nation of Israel. Through Israel, God would bring blessing to all the peoples of the earth. And through Israel, God would establish a kingdom that would never end. David also has some serious problems. Certainly is not presented as a perfect or sinless character. Most people are familiar with David's adultery with Bathsheba, including how he orchestrated the murder of her husband Uriah. Now, in that story, or in addition to that story, we also read how David grew distant from his people and did not always rule in righteousness. One example of that is how David failed to punish even sin in his own house. And that story would eventually lead to a full-on rebellion that nearly cost David the kingship. Probably the most serious issue is when David plans to take a census of the nation. The reason was that this was a problem for David to take a census was because at this point, David had actually conquered the whole of the promised land. All the land that God had promised for the nation of Israel, they already had control of it. But by taking a census, David was signaling his intention to expand the borders of Israel beyond what God had given to the people. In other words, being a king in Israel was no longer good enough for David. He wanted to conquer the ancient Near East, and he wanted to become an emperor. David's story is complicated, but through his life, we're able to see God's continued faithfulness to his covenant with the nation. In the stories of the kings of Judah which follow, David will serve as the standard by which other kings are compared. Other kings are often considered good when they are like David, and evil when they are not like him. Eventually, David does die, and his son Solomon succeeds him on the throne in Jerusalem. Due to David's military success, Solomon inherits control of a massive area of land, from the so-called Brook of Egypt in the south all the way to the Euphrates in the north. And this gives Solomon access to seaports on the Mediterranean, as well as the Gulf of Aqaba that connects to the Red Sea. Effectively, Solomon had control of all the trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and this allowed him to gain massive wealth. He led huge building projects, which were largely funded through taxes. And these projects would include military strongholds, fortifications. Solomon also expanded the city of Jerusalem. In David's time, Jerusalem was little more than a strategic military stronghold. David more than doubled the walls of the city and helped to transform it really into like a thriving city. His two most significant building projects were the temple and the royal palace. Now, the palace was built on a hill in the city called the Ophel, which gave the king a view over the rest of the city. The temple was built at the very top of the Ophel, on its highest point. For the first time since Israel left Mount Sinai, the Ark of the Covenant would no longer be kept in the tabernacle, but instead would have a permanent home in the temple. This illustration shows Solomon's temple, including a look inside. It bears some resemblance to the tabernacle. On the outside, we see the great altar for making sacrifices, as well as a large basin or reservoir of water that was called the sea. This was huge. It held about 11,000 gallons of water. Inside the temple was filled with all kinds of imagery from the Garden of Eden, just as God was present with Adam in the garden. He is also present in Jerusalem in the midst of the nation of Israel. The innermost room of this temple, called the Holy of Holies, or the Most Holy Place, was the new home for the Ark of the Covenant. And the temple became the symbol of God's presence in the midst of his people Israel. Now, later, we'll see that the Israelites naively believed that they would never be conquered by another nation because God's temple, they thought that guaranteed that God would be with them and protect them regardless of their behavior. Now, of course, Solomon was also famous for having many wives. These wives were largely the result of trade agreements he was making with other nations. As he would make a trade agreement, he would take daughters and princesses and different women as wives for him to establish those trade agreements. The massive number, 700 wives, 300 concubines, is a reflection of Solomon's greed. Now, we've seen in other stories already that having a foreign wife is not a problem if she adopts the God of Israel and agrees to follow him, if she converts to follow the Torah. The problem with Solomon's wives is that they bring their idols with them, and Solomon allows them to build shrines to these idols. Unlike his father David, Solomon's heart was turned away from God, breaking the covenant Israel had made with God at Mount Sinai. And that concludes the relatively brief time we call the United Monarchy. And so the next video will begin to discuss the divided monarchy.